We've all heard the pitch. Just put a textbook under your pillow or strap on a specialized headset while you nap and wake up knowing how to pilot a commercial jet or effortlessly play the cello. It's the ultimate fantasy of absorbing knowledge like a sponge in the dark. But here is a jarring, frankly counterintuitive truth. Subliminal learning is a complete biological myth. It is biologically impossible. If you aren't paying active, friction-filled attention to what is right in front of you, absolutely zero learning is happening. It just bounces right off. This breakdown of the cognitive architecture of learning can also be found on our website, nolator.com. Let's get into it. Think of your mind as an engineering problem. We use mental models for everything else in life. Economics relies on supply and demand. Biology uses natural selection. But when it comes to the underlying architecture of how we actually learn, people just sort of wing it. They hope for the best. Learning, however, has an underlying cognitive architecture. It is a physical infrastructure inside your skull. And the absolute foundational piece of that infrastructure is the physical limit of your working memory. Your working memory has a microscopic, incredibly rigid bottleneck. For decades, popular culture pushed the idea that the brain could hold about 7 items at once. It's why we used to think license plates or the classic length of a postal code were capped at that length. But as our understanding of the brain has advanced, we've had to aggressively update that number downward. The true capacity of your working memory is a mere 4 items. Just 4 isolated pieces of information can be held in your conscious thought at any given moment. This is the ultimate choke point for every single memory or skill you will ever acquire in your entire life. Now, why would evolution design a brain that can build rockets but only hold 4 thoughts? It comes down to metabolic cost. The most metabolically expensive operation your brain can perform is holding novel, unintegrated information in your prefrontal cortex. If evolution had given you a working memory capacity of 100 items, the caloric demand would be so catastrophic that you would literally starve to death just from thinking. So the brain evolved a ruthless energy-saving mechanism. Because this bandwidth is so aggressively limited, how you manage cognitive load becomes the single most important factor in learning. If you devote even a fraction of your mental bandwidth to irrelevant information, you don't just slow down your learning process, you halt it entirely. It creates a complete traffic jam at the bottleneck. To navigate this without crashing the system, there are major architectural rules we have to follow. The first rule dictates that worked examples are vastly superior to pure problem-solving for beginners. We have an entire cultural narrative built around the idea that struggling and figuring things out the hard way builds character. But biologically, forcing a novice to solve a problem from scratch is disastrous. Imagine trying to assemble a high-performance drone from a cardboard box of loose wires, circuit boards, and unmarked titanium screws with absolutely no manual. You stare at the pile, get completely overwhelmed, and start guessing. Your 4-item bottleneck is instantly maxed out on useless questions like, does this wire connect here? You aren't learning the principles of robotics. You're just drowning in cognitive overload. The struggle isn't productive. But if I hand you a fully assembled drone to inspect, alongside isolated step-by-step visual instructions, you bypass the bottleneck entirely. You use your 4 slots to instantly learn the structural logic. The second rule is no split attention. Information must be integrated into a single visual or mental field. If you are analyzing a complex financial spreadsheet, but the definitions for the data are buried in a separate document you have to constantly tab over to, you are forcing your brain to hold an item in your working memory while physically scanning for the matching part. You are burning up one of those precious 4 slots just acting as a delivery service. Third, you must minimize redundancy and eliminate what we call the cognitive penalty of seductive details. Think about studying a dense medical anatomy textbook, but the margins are filled with pop-up trivia about the personal lives of 19th century surgeons. Those details are interesting, but they do not directly serve the core concept. Processing that trivia literally steals bandwidth from processing the actual anatomy. It acts as cognitive static. Complex ideas must be violently chunked, broken down into their absolute smallest isolated components, passed through the 4-item security checkpoint one by one, and only combined once they are safely stored on the other side. So once you get the information through the door, how do you get the brain to permanently hit the save button? This brings us to the retrieval imperative. We have to confront the grand illusion of rereading. When most people need to memorize a massive 100-slide technical presentation for a major client pitch, they default to rereading. They stare at their notes over and over. It feels highly fluent. You think, yes, I know this. But remember, your brain is a ruthless economizer of energy. When it sees the answer sitting right there on the screen, it subconsciously calculates that there is no urgent need to encode this into a long-term neural pathway. It flags the information as "do not need to store." The actionable strategy is active retrieval. You read one slide, physically close the laptop, and force your brain to generate the key points entirely from scratch. It is a physically uncomfortable process, but that feeling of mental friction acts as a blazing biological flare. It tells your nervous system, "Warning, we need this information to survive, and it is scarce." If you just reread your notes, it is the mental equivalent of running on a treadmill with zero incline. It feels easy, but there is no adaptation. Active retrieval is cranking the incline up to the maximum. The resistance itself is the growth. But let's be realistic. Even if you use active retrieval perfectly, time passes and you inevitably forget things. Say you spent months mastering college physics, but if you took an exam today, your mind would be a total blank. Is that knowledge gone forever? No. You have to stop viewing memory as a binary state. Memory is a biological threshold problem. Imagine your memory strength exists on a scale from 0 to 100, and you need a strength of 35 to consciously recall a formula. Over the years, through lack of use, your physics memory degrades from an 80 down to a 34. Because it is below the conscious threshold, it feels entirely erased. But the infrastructure is still in place. It's like an old, abandoned train track buried under the snow. Building a memory from zero is like laying the heavy steel rails and wooden ties through the wilderness. It takes brutal, back-breaking labor. But relearning something you've forgotten is just running a snowplow over the tracks. The foundation is already there. You only need to push the memory from a 34 back to a 36. It requires a microscopic amount of effort compared to clawing your way up from zero. Now, how does the mind navigate entirely unfamiliar territory to solve a brand new problem? When you face the unknown, your brain executes a problem space search. You are essentially navigating an abstract maze defined by a start state, an end state, and specific constraints. Think about untangling a massive chaotic ball of holiday lights. The start state is the mess, the end state is a straight wire, and the constraints are the physical reality of the chords. If you do not know the specific patterns, you resort to brute force. You pull randomly, testing every manipulation, usually making the knot significantly tighter. True learning is the acquisition of specific patterns that allow you to completely bypass that exhausting brute force search. Mastery is simply collecting enough mental shortcuts so that you never have to randomly pull at the wire. But here is where human logic hits a wall. Humans do not reason using abstract mathematical rules. We reason by constructing mental situation models, internal physical visualizations. If I give you the logic statement, all vehicles have wheels. A motorcycle is a vehicle, therefore a motorcycle has wheels. Your brain doesn't process that like computer code. It literally visualizes a physical grouping of cars and trucks and then mentally drops a motorcycle into that visual group to check if it belongs. This absolute need to build a mental diorama makes us mathematically blind in certain situations, creating severe cognitive traps like the availability bias. Let's test this in real time. Are there more English words that end with the suffix "ly", like quickly, softly, loudly, or are there more words where the letter L is the second to last letter? Think about it. Most people confidently say there are more words ending in "ly". Why? Because your brain immediately searches its mental diorama and easily visualizes those adverbs. But mathematically, that answer is impossible. Every single "ly" word inherently has L as the second to last letter. Plus, you have thousands of other words like walk, talk, milk, and half. The second category is vastly larger, but because we cannot easily visualize a diorama of words organized by their second-to-last letter, we default to what is easier to picture. We mistake visual fluency for actual statistical probability. To calibrate our practice and avoid spinning our wheels, we have to leverage the 85% rule. Modern culture screams at us to fail fast and embrace failure. But from a cognitive architecture perspective, failure is incredibly low information data. It only tells you one highly specific, incorrect path out of millions. Success, however, is high information data. It instantly illuminates the correct route. Therefore, the optimal learning zone is an 85% success rate. You are succeeding enough to build the right patterns, but you're experiencing a 15% failure rate to provide just enough mental friction to keep your brain alert. You have to actively adjust your environment, switching from open book to closed book or adding time limits, to manually toggle your difficulty and stay in that sweet spot. When you consistently hit that biological growth zone, your knowledge begins to compound. This is the growth matrix. The amount you are capable of learning is heavily physically dependent on what you already know. When you encounter new information, it needs cognitive hooks to attach to. If you are starting a brand new subject, you have zero hooks. It's like trying to assemble a massive, complex jigsaw puzzle by starting in the dead center of an empty table. The pieces slide around, they don't lock. This is why the foundational phase of learning is objectively the most painful part. But once you build that border, that base layer, you suddenly have hundreds of exposed connection points. Every new piece of information snaps right into an existing groove. The compounding interest of information means the more you know, the faster you can learn even more. This compounding effect shatters the myth of the lone creative genius. True creativity is not a magical lightning bolt from the void. Innovation is simply an evolutionary mutation within a problem space. Once the collective jigsaw puzzle of human knowledge reaches a certain point, the exact same next logical piece becomes obvious to anyone looking closely. This also reveals the illusion of transfer. There is a persistent myth that practicing one hard intellectual skill magically levels up your entire brain. But the brain is not a Swiss Army knife where sharpening the blade magically sharpens the scissors. Transfer only happens when two specific tasks share overlapping if-then production rules. If you spend 10,000 hours mastering a snowboard, it will drastically speed up your ability to surf, because the underlying physics and balance rules overlap perfectly. But that discipline will do absolutely nothing to help you learn conversational Japanese. Breadth of highly specific knowledge is the only true driver of general intelligence. And as you master these specific skills, you face the final trap, the curse of automaticity. As skills automate through thousands of hours of practice, they free up your bottleneck, but the knowledge becomes entirely invisible to your conscious mind. This causes expert blindness. If I ask you right now exactly what your left index finger does during the second loop of tying your shoelaces, your brain freezes. The knowledge is physically there, but you can't articulate it. This is why highly skilled experts are often terrible teachers for beginners. They cannot consciously access the basic steps anymore. Because automated skills run on invisible autopilot, they fiercely resist conscious adjustment. The only way to break a plateau is to purposefully introduce extreme, uncomfortable difficulty to force the autopilot off and re-engage your conscious working memory. Before we summarize how to apply this, just a quick reminder that you can find more knowledge translated at nolater.com. Let's bring all of this together. Learning is not the passive absorption of facts. It is the deliberate architectural construction of a highly organized cognitive framework. To truly master a subject, you must first respect your biological bottleneck. You can only process 4 items at a time, so rely on worked examples, eliminate split attention, and ruthlessly cut out redundant details. Next, you must trigger the encoding process through active retrieval. Put the notes away and endure the mental friction of recalling the information from scratch. To ensure you're actually progressing, actively calibrate your challenges to maintain an 85% success rate. And finally, recognize that the brutal frustration of being a beginner isn't a lack of talent. It is simply the process of building your first cognitive hooks. Push through that initial friction and let the compound interest of information take over. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If our entire cognitive architecture, our ability to solve problems, to be creative, to build complex skills, relies completely on having a massive internal foundation of specific facts to act as hooks for new knowledge, what happens when we completely outsource our memory? We use search engines for every question. We use AI to synthesize our reading and untangle our problem spaces. If we never force ourselves to endure the friction of memorizing the basics, if we never lay down those first slippery puzzle pieces, do we eventually lose the biological capacity to build complex compound knowledge entirely? Are we dissolving our own cognitive hooks? It's something to think about the next time you ask an algorithm for the answer, instead of wrestling with the problem yourself. And that is the cognitive architecture of learning translated. I'm your host, and this is Nolator, your knowledge translator. For more breakdowns, head over to nolator.com.